It's very rare that I have a topic in which I can hand an L to both game developers and gamers. But today we are going to talk about Endgame and how it is ruining video games. Now, at one point I thought that Endgame was something that was exclusive to MMORPGs. But as time has passed, this has expanded to other genres and has become a big problem. Now, I shouldn't have to explain it, but I'm going to go ahead in case you're unfamiliar. Endgame is essentially repeatable content in a video game after you've gone through the bulk of its other subject matter, and exists for the most part to encourage player retention. Now, in an MMO, that makes a whole lot of sense because you want it to feel alive and you want to keep your players playing it. But again, this has spread far and beyond just MMOs. There's a high probability that you've seen it. A new game will come out, and it will receive a bunch of comments saying, "Oh my gosh, this is awful. There's no in-game content." A vocal minority, but still present. Game developers will see these comments and go, "Oh my gosh, we have to do something," because as time goes on, more and more people are going to reach that point in our video game and then complain that there's nothing left to do. So what ends up happening is these game developers will quickly put together some sort of content, usually a remix of pre-existing assets or game activities, and that will be the end game. But at that point in time, the comments will go from "there is no end game" to "the end game is just really bad." Well, of course the end game is terrible. You've pressured the developers into rushing and stitching something together spur of the moment, instead of something that's planned over a period of time and thought out. You've got something that's stitched together and rushed, like a student who's trying to do their homework in class a couple of moments before they have to turn it in. But lazy and rushed content is far from the only example of Endgame being a big problem. One of my go-to examples is back when I was still a warrior of light playing Final Fantasy XIV. It was the Shadowbringer expansion, and Nier Automata was at the peak of its popularity. Even though most people who played Nier Automata haven't played Nier Replicant or Gestalt, and haven't played any Drakengard games. I wonder where they are now. Probably at a toilet bowl, fishing out every single log-shaped Souls-like game that they can get their hands on. Final Fantasy XIV had announced a crossover raid with Nier Automata, and this was an absolute disaster. You see, there were a lot of people who had been playing Nier Automata and having a great time, and that's good. I'm happy for them. But when they wanted to experience the content that was being added to Final Fantasy XIV, they were new players. And in order to experience that raid, you would have had to create your account, make your character, go through all of Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, all of its post-story content. Then you would have had to get Heavensward, the first expansion, and all of its post-campaign content. After that, you would need to do Stormblood expansion pack and all of its post-campaign content. And then you would have to get Shadowbringers, go through all of that, and go through enough of its post-campaign content in order to reach the Nier Automata content. That is a lot of shit you have to do. Now, your average player would have been like, that's a bit too much, and I don't want to do it. But, unfortunately for us 14 players, there was a solution for them. And it exists in the form of content skips. You could pay a sum of real money to have your character's level boosted as well as skip through the main story of several of the expansion packs. Now, anybody who's played 14 will tell you that Alliance raids are almost never all that difficult. They're never the hardest things that you can do in the game, but they still require a certain level of understanding as far as your basic combat mechanics, as well as how your particular job functions, what your skills do, how you're supposed to use them, and when is an appropriate time to use them. But for a bunch of new players who are playing the game for the first time, or playing it seriously for the first time, paying for these skips all of that. All of the context is omitted. All of the time that you would have spent getting used to how certain jobs handle and play in your role in a party is completely bypassed. That meant that there were a lot of people who didn't know what they were doing in places they should have never been. And that, of course, would be a problem for anyone trying to do that new raid, but it goes further than that. You see, as I said before, you still have to go through the post-content for Shadowbringers and the content for Shadowbringers itself. That means that there were a bunch of new players in the latest expansion of an MMO who had pretty much never done anything. So trying to get through dungeons became a nightmare. The duty roulette, where you're matched with random players for various activities, dungeons, and other things, was a nightmare. Experienced players developed a deep sense of resentment for newer players, because most of them were only there to experience a single tiny sliver of what the entire game had to offer. This is an issue that Final Fantasy XIV has in general. As they move the goalpost and push the finish line further and further out, you can really feel the game stretch and stretch and stretch itself thin. As it gets more patches, I've started to only hear two things from that game, and that is the quality of the raids at the end of whatever patch cycle they're on, or, for everybody else, how far the quality of things like dungeons and the story have fallen over time. But what about a situation that's a little bit different? In Final Fantasy XIV, at the very, very least, the things that you do at the start of the game, the middle of the game, and at the end of the game are relatively similar. They just have a little bit of ramped up difficulty and speed of execution. But what about a situation where that's not the case, where the game's content changes so very differently that it's almost like you're playing something totally separate? Where the end game and early game don't seem to meet at any point in time, and feel disconnected. For that, we need to look no further than The First Descendant. Now, if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you'll know that I do not like The First Descendant. But if you've been following for a very long time, you'll know that in the closed beta for The First Descendant, I loved the game and was very excited for it to come out. When it did, I was vastly disappointed and let down, and no matter how many times I tried to come back to the game, the fundamental issues were always there to remind me why I quit in the first place. A bunch of my friends have told me, Eris, just get through the campaign. The end game is so much better. And to that, I always roll my eyes, tilt my head back, and sigh deeply. To me, this is the equivalent of being told that I just need to get to the good part of my meal, and I've done a video about that very, very topic. I haven't gotten to the good part. What the hell are you talking about? The whole thing is supposed to be the good part. Now, I haven't done it, so I don't know if they're just coping or what the deal is, but the general idea is that I'm at a part of the game that is incredibly bad, and if I just push past it, then I will get to the part that everybody seems to be in love with. Now, I understand that the end game, as time goes on, becomes like the primary amount of the game, but you still have to get to that point to experience it. You see what I'm saying? So even if the end game is most of the game now, and it is of a higher quality, the rest of the game has been ignored. This is another example of The finish line being the part that everybody's excited about, but you have to skip through a bunch of bullshit in order to get there, which I'm unwilling to do. Now, in this situation, I'm thinking to myself, well, if the end game really is as good as you say, how come they won't take the time to polish up the early game, the part of the game that players are going to be experiencing first, and the part of the game that will drive them away the fastest, if it's not good? Because a lot of other people share my same opinion in that the part of the game that we're stuck at sucks so bad, it doesn't really matter what the rest of the game looks like. Now, some people are like, well, how can you write a review for a game that you haven't finished? Very, very easily, actually. I mean, I don't need to eat the food off of a plate that has a turd on it to know that it's probably a bad idea to do that. The fact that you can do it, I guess, is neat, but I should advise that you not do that sort of thing. You shouldn't, and I refuse to. So I've got a lot of negative things to say about Endgame and the way that different live service games implement them. But do I have any examples of it being done right? Absolutely. One of my personal favorite go-tos of Endgame done right just so happens to be Warframe. Now, I'm not saying that Warframe doesn't have any endgame at all, but the way that they handle adding content to that game and the way that players experience it is just kind of better. You see, when they add content to Warframe, sometimes it requires you to go through various other things in the game, but they do it in a way where it doesn't necessarily feel as linear. So rather than stretching the game narrow-wise, they pull the game and make it wider. There are a lot of times where you can do things out of order to a certain extent, and all of the various activities that they add to Warframe have their own version of, like, in-game content, if that makes any sense. For example, there's like a faction system in which you can pick up to, if you're min-maxing, you can pick up to 3 different factions to rank up. Each of those factions have various items that you can spend the credits or the currency that they use on those items. And for any items that are part of a faction that you can't access because they don't get along, you can trade with other players. But once you're done getting all of the items from that faction, there's still value in being in them and interacting with that system because you can buy things like relics. Relics is an activity in which you can earn prime parts, various upgrades for, or upgraded versions of different weapons and warframes. And those too can be traded with other players or used for yourself if you need to. This is a system that plays well with other systems in the game, and is a way to avoid the sensation that a new player needs to rush and get through something in order to enjoy some other form of content. Now, yes, there are activities like the Steel Path, in which you have to go through the entire star chart, but the Steel Path consists widely of the exact same activities that you would be doing outside of the Steel Path. And there really is not a whole lot of point in rushing to that content because, again, you're just getting upgrades to things that you can get otherwise. So a new player doesn't have to feel pressured to skipping through and ruining their experience in order to get to something that a veteran player has. As a result, that means that new players can usually count on the help of veteran players in order to do the content that they're at. There's no resentment in new players, and the community overall is better for it. Now, this is very fun for me to say out loud, because a lot of people have the impression that I don't like Warframe or Digital Extremes because of the direction that the game is going. And while I definitely don't like all of the content they've added over the years, the majority of my experience with Warframe has always been positive. And I can pretty much recommend that game to people who haven't played it without any asterisks or major caveats. So if you've never played Warframe before, it's just a good game. It's got some peaks, it's got some valleys, but your overall experience is probably going to be pretty positive, assuming of course that you're not playing on a toaster. That's not the only game though. Another good example of a game that has a difficult to define in-game system just so happens to be Phantasy Star Online 2. Now, most of my time with Phantasy Star Online 2 has been spent on the Japanese servers. I have thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, and even though I don't play on those servers anymore for various reasons, even the vastly inferior North American release of PSO2 still has a difficult to define endgame. That doesn't mean that it's not there, but because Phantasy Star Online 2 has so many different activities that scale in difficulty as you level up your character in various classes, the endgame kind of becomes something that you as an individual have to kind of figure out for yourself. I personally made my endgame trying to craft a weapon that could do as much damage as possible. Some other people might find their endgame is centered around crafting and customizing their abilities, maybe selling those abilities to other players, which is something that you can do in that game. There are various encounters that are called trigger quests, in which you can trigger certain monsters and bosses to spawn and engage with them. Those quests have very high difficulty, so even though they're creatures that you can encounter in normal gameplay, using a trigger will cause them to spawn with much more aggression, higher level, more damage, etc., etc. There are emergency quests that you do at higher difficulties that can be incredibly challenging and difficult to do, even if you're with a team of trusted players. There are in-game quests that deal with various enemies and bosses throughout the story, like the Masquerade, Photonners, Dark Falls, and all of its various forms, and much, much more. Quartz Dragons, etc. All of that means that a new player getting into Phantasy Star Online probably isn't even going to know. Like, they might have an idea of what they can encounter, but they're not going to know when they will or at what difficulty. I'm not trying to say that the content is random, but if you were to ask a bunch of veteran players what the end game of Phantasy Star is, I highly doubt you'd get the same answer from all of them. Now, I have much less experience with the new Genesis side of Phantasy Star Online 2 because I'm just not that big of a fan of it. I do play it every now and then, but nowhere near as much as the base game. And the end game of that also seems to be very, very confusing. I have no idea what you do at the end game. I have one max level class in New Genesis, and there are, just like the base game, several different activities that I can do that will challenge me and test my abilities to navigate different encounters with the enemies of that version of the game. So I would say that at the very least, despite all of its other many, many problems, Phantasy Star Online 2 has a good approach to endgame. I'm still able to encounter players that are doing a bunch of different activities in both New Genesis and the base game Phantasy Star Online 2. Even though the player numbers are definitely lower than I or even Sega would like them to be. Endgame is a very unfortunate idea that pollutes a game and pressures new players into skipping what is essentially the bulk of a game in order to reach something that is added at the very end. It's the equivalent of a kid in school opening up a Lunchable and only eating the dessert part of the little pockets, and then throwing the rest of the food away. only to complain that they're still hungry and they don't have enough. This sort of idea is very, very frustrating when it comes to dealing with new players as a veteran of your game of choice. And it also encourages game developers to continue this cycle of rushed content. And the problem is that as time has gone on, developers have done just that. They've catered to these players who ignore a bulk of the work that goes into a video game. And as a result, those are the areas of gaming that get ignored more and more. But that's going to do it for me. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video.